All right, good morning, Kevin Petersen, licensed marriage and family therapist, petersenfamilycounseling.com, published author, book number 2, right around the corner. We're already, what's the status?
Well, I actually have the, thanks for asking, I have the rough draft and I'm finalizing it. And so the goal is to have it available on Amazon and on Kindle by the end of the year.
Awesome.
The title is Chronic Hope, Families in Addiction.
Great.
Yeah.
That's great. Which is a supplement to Chronic Hope, Parenting the Addicted Child.
It's maybe not a supplement, but it's sort of the continuation of the concept. Yeah, Addicted Child is really more designed for what do we do with the person who's under 18, and it really is kind of a quick 100-page fast attack. Let's go. Here's the plan. The second book is much more in depth on what do we do about the family and how do we heal the family, and then how do we reunify everybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, many of our viewers know me. I'm Chris. I'm one of the directors at the Augustine Recovery Center. We have a small family-owned and operated long-term inpatient center for men struggling with addiction and trauma. And Kevin and I have been getting together frequently and doing these recovery at home episodes, which started as like recovery at home because of COVID. And now it's really kind of morphing into recovery at home, as in the family is at home while the loved one is in treatment. And let's talk about what recovery at their house looks like, and all things in between.
Yeah, exactly.
So I wanted to talk about mental health and addiction, kind of which came first, the chicken, or the egg, the horse or the cart. Oftentimes on the front end of what we do on the admission side, family members are identifying what they believe is mental health, and they're not quite sure how to differentiate mental health with active addiction. For instance, my loved one is, struggling with addiction, maybe a meth addiction, and he also is bipolar. And I generally ask, well, has he been professionally diagnosed after a significant amount of clean time? Because active addiction, especially addiction like meth addiction, often presents like bipolar with the highs and the lows. And so I think there's a couple schools of thought, in this industry as far as what needs to be treated first. And it sounds like you have some pretty strong feelings about that. So I wanted to dive into that today head first.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Chris. And I believe, it is a chicken or the egg type of situation where you have, I get the same phone call where it's like, oh my God, what are we going to do about my, 25-year-old or my husband or my wife or whatever? And, they suffer from depression and anxiety. They suffer from bipolar. My other personal favorite is he's an alcoholic and he's a narcissist, or she's an alcoholic and she's a borderline personality. Yeah. And what I always tell people is, well, then we start talking about, okay, what are we going to do? Here are the processes, how to go about it. I say, well, I think ultimately they're going to probably need to go to treatment. And the first response is, I don't think dealing with the drugs and alcohol, the substance abuse, is going to solve the problem. Yeah. And I said, well, here's the thing. And kind of like what you were referring to earlier, we have to eliminate the drugs and the alcohol so we can get a baseline of their mental health. I also get all the time where families will send a client or a person to a psychologist to have a full psych eval, full psych workup while they're using. Yeah. And what'll come back is, oh my God, they're ADD or ADHD or bipolar or borderline. It's like, well, yeah, because they're riding the roller coaster. Yeah. And why don't we take that? Why don't we eliminate the drugs and the alcohol, give them a new way to live, and this is the really critical piece, then we can address all the mental health issues, because a lot of the mental health issues we're talking about, those diagnoses, are a result of heavy duty trauma. Yeah. But we got to, in order to get there, we got to clean up the initial drugs and alcohol stuff. Yeah.
And I mean, what does that look like once somebody's in treatment and they've been there for a while? How do you kind of organize? It's like trying to tell me what color that table is, and it's littered with magazines and postcards and a year's worth of junk mail. And you're like, that's a table made out of wood. And I'm like, well, let's clear off the mess first before we, start identifying, things beneath it.
Yeah.
How do you kind of get to the core of what's going on?
Well, like you said, we established initially probably about at least 30 days, if not more, of straight up sobriety. And when I say sobriety, I mean total abstinence from all drugs and alcohol, street drugs. I don't care if it's legal or illegal, we eliminate them. And then we start doing, we try to create more of a stabilization environment. So at a place like Augustine Recovery, where you guys do a 90-day program, the first 30 to 45 days is probably just trying to get the person to, wake up on time, go to things on time, get into a regular pattern of daily life, of wake up, take a shower, have breakfast, go to group, go to therapy, go to the events, go to the meetings, have lunch, have dinner, and get back into that regular rhythm of life, and so we can create a baseline. And that everyone's different. Some people might be able to catch that baseline in a couple weeks. Some people might take a couple months, depending on the level of stuff that they're bringing into the table. Like your analogy of depending on how cluttered the table is, how many layers of things there are that we got to get through. And so that, it really can take anywhere from a couple weeks to a couple months to just scratch the surface to get to the stuff.
Which is probably why it's so important for the initial inpatient treatment experience to be longer than 30 days, because how are you establishing a baseline in 30 days and then also creating, a discharge plan and figuring out what's going on mentally, emotionally, cognitively in any efficient way in less than 90 days.
Well, you're not, is the truth. And what I love is when I have someone that comes, a representative that comes to me and says, hey, I work at this 30-day treatment center, and here are all the methodologies of treatment we do, including, all these trauma level treatments, and I'm like, how are you doing trauma work on someone that's like 2 weeks sober? How's that a possibility? They're so tweaked out, they're not even at a place where they're stabilized. And so that's why I really think the program that you guys offer is such a huge strength, is that it allows for the client to get back on their feet, get their head above water, take a deep breath, look around and be like, oh, okay, I get it. And start to really address their stuff. Now, on the family side, right, because that's the client side, on the family side, the family is also traumatized by the situation because they've been chasing the roller coaster, and they're like, oh my God, they always say the same things. He's bipolar, he's borderline, he's narcissistic. And the thing I always say is, well, here's the deal. Let's get him some help. Let's get him to an environment where we eliminate the drugs and the alcohol, really start to address the way of life through the 12 steps. And we can also really start to engage with him on individual and group therapy and do some really neat experiential stuff and awaken them inside and see what's going on. And I think that's when we can really start to see significant recovery on that side as well. Now, the other side of it too is, and this is really critical, is that the family has to be doing the same work for themselves, because the worst thing we can do is do a 90-day program. Let's say they stay for another 90 days into the outpatient program, and then we bring them back to the family, and the family is still treating them like it was on day one. All that's going to do is push that person right back into that environment, because that's the expectation.
It's almost like all the work is for nothing if they go back to the same environment that they left and it hasn't gotten any better. It's almost for naught if the family isn't meeting them where they are when they get out of treatment. And I could have been labeled as somebody who was chronically depressed when I went to treatment, but that's because I was drinking and smoking weed every day.
Yeah,
Talking about like
which are
two of
depressants.
the heaviest depressants there are.
Yeah.
And that's why I have, kind of in a different realm, you talk about all these kids in school who are being diagnosed with mental health disorders, and how many of them are probably not, sober, at least, maybe smoking weed or drinking on the weekends, which, the residual effect of that, activity on the weekends into the weekday. I mean, there's no baseline. And then, all these kids are on, ADD medication or what have you. And
yeah,
it can get out of hand really quickly.
yeah, it really can. And I mean, we've gotten to the point where as soon as somebody shows any sort of symptom of activity or behavior that's abnormal or outside, the box, right? We immediately stick them into a category where we feel like we have to medicate that, like, oh, they're hyperactive, we have to medicate that. It's like, well, okay, sure. I'm not saying medication's bad. As a matter of fact, I'm a huge advocate for medication. There's plenty of people that definitely need help. But I don't think every 16-year-old boy needs speed,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I don't know that that's necessarily the solution to every problem, and I think the danger there too is that we start sort of chasing this imaginary stability position of, we got to do a little bit more speed and a little bit more depressant and a little bit here, a little bit there.
Yeah.
And the thing I liked about the mental health program, or the community mental health facility that I worked at when I graduated from my graduate program, was that you couldn't see a psychiatrist and get meds unless you were going to weekly therapy.
Yeah.
That was their rule. It's like, sure, we'll help you with the meds, but you have to see a therapist, because pills treat symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
Therapy goes after the digged in. Let's dig in and deal with the behavior.
Right. Yeah.
And that just takes time. And again, our society is very quick fix oriented, and we want to solve the problem like that.
Yep.
And the thing is, it took years to cement the problem. It's going to take some time to uncement it and get it cleaned up and change.
Yeah, recovery is not a quick investment. The return on investment in recovery is over a very long period of time, which I think is why it can be such a hard pill for some people to swallow. That we're talking about years, really, before you start seeing there's some exceptions to the rule. I had a guy who I lived with in sober living, and you talk about financial gain. Most people don't see significant financial gain in recovery until years. I know for me, it was, financial stability was years and years and years and years after I finally got sober. This guy went to the poker room in Minneapolis and won like 50 grand on a hand of poker in his first 30 days of sobriety. And so, he bought a car, and, he put some money down on his own place, and he's actually still sober. That's typically not a recipe for success in early recovery, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, financial stability, mental health, stabilization, potentially, getting yourself off of any meds that you may have been put on in treatment. I mean, it takes a long time. This is a process that we're talking about. Which is why 90 days is so important. And the truth of it is 90 days is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, if the objective is to launch your recovery, rocket into space, your mental health rocket into space, treatment is just research and development. It's what you do after that's the launch pad. And if you don't do anything after, it's like you put your recovery rocket out into the scrapyard, to gather rust. There's no point if there's nothing happening after treatment. So I know you believe in it, and we really believe in long term. Most of our guys tend to stay longer than 90 days, maybe around 120 or 140 days, because you talk about trauma work. Most of these guys aren't even getting into their trauma work until maybe their 40th day, because maybe they're detoxing. I mean, the stimulant addicts are sleeping maybe for weeks because they've been up for weeks, or having trouble sleeping for weeks. So You really need a clear mind to start digging into some of this really, really deep stuff. And it can be hard to leave no stone unturned if you have like the residual effects of, long-term drug or alcohol abuse, hanging
Yep.
around.
Yep. Absolutely. It just takes time, and everybody's different. And that's why the longer someone stays engaged in treatment, the better. And I always tell people that the real work is not in the first 30, 60, 90 days. The real work is the first day you leave.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Now you've built the foundation and you're ready to roll. So now, do you walk into a 12-step meeting? Do you engage with a therapist? Are you engaging with a doctor?
Mm-hmm.
Are you getting back on track? Are you walking back into real life, and really, and walking in with all your tools prepared and ready to roll?
Yeah.
And that's the piece. And that's why, again, now we're back to the original question of, substance abuse or mental health, which one's more important? And the answer is yes and yes.
Yeah, they both.
Yeah. And because by all means, people that struggle with mental health issues will self-medicate. But
Mm-hmm.
let's be clear, not everybody that self-medicates is an alcoholic or an addict,
Yeah.
And there's just a certain percentage of the population that once they start self-medicating, they can't stop.
Yeah.
And that's the people we're talking about. So they kind of get to be they get the double whammy of, oh yeah, you do have bipolar, you do have, narcissism, borderline, whatever, manic depression. And it turns out when you drink and use drugs, you can't control it or stop when you want to stop. So we got to get that out of the way first so we can get to the other piece.
Yeah. Which I've been fortunate to really never, aside from inactive addiction, I've really never struggled with mental health. And if you do, and you're also struggling with addiction, you really need to buckle down and work hard, because I've seen the challenges that come from having a mental health diagnosis and also being in recovery. And it requires a lot of courage and persistency and accountability. So there's nothing easy about this. There's nothing easy about the work we do, or about being a person in long-term recovery. And that's why, unfortunately, the odds are stacked against us. So you really got to keep your chin up, and you got to keep trudging, as they say, trudging the road to happy destiny.
And you don't have to do it alone.
Correct.
That's the most important thing, is that, the beauty of trudging the road to happy destiny, or engaging in a recovery way of life, is, you can do therapy, you can see a psychiatrist, you can do meetings, you can do, you can create a community of people that are all fighting the same battle and looking to engage in the same success and moving forward. And that's the thing, is that I always tell people, well, the bad news is, you're an alcoholic or an addict, and the good news is we have a plan, we have a solution. And the thing is, the solution's awesome, it's great, it's so much fun, but then now we're starting to talk about fighting the stigma of mental health and addiction, of, oh my God, you're one of them. And it's like, okay, first of all, let's be clear. Every family I know has some level of existence in mental health or substance abuse. And so we all need help. We all need to track our stuff.
Yep. And that stigma, that could perhaps be addressed in another episode, because that's
maybe we should talk about the stigma next time we get together.
I think that's a great idea. That's a great idea. I think we might see some support from a new administration with the mental health, substance use stigma.
Yes, I would hope so. I mean, that I would hope that whoever is in charge can understand and address the concept of that mental health and addiction creates. There's so many rippling effects into our society. You walk into jail and prison, and those guys are all suffering. The majority of those guys are dealing with drug and alcohol issues, a lot of mental health issues.
Yep.
You go into the hospitals and you start looking at people that are in long-term care, drugs, alcohol, mental health, and, these are things that if we could, the thing we're talking about is being proactive and and that's, that's the thing that we have to start changing. But let's talk about that next time.
That sounds great. I'd love to do that.
Yeah,
we need to keep our viewers' attention. So
yes.
if we get into another realm here, we might lose them. So thank you so
Yeah.
much. Always great to have these chats, and hopefully we can knock another one out later this week.
I would love that, and I would love to address the stigma of mental health and addiction. And
Great.
have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Have a great week.
Okay.